Welcome to the second lesson of the A-level course. We're going to begin today's lesson with a brief overview of the end of the Great War, the end of the First World War. Well, to begin with, back in October of 1917, the Bolshevik communists had taken power within Russia. One of their slogans was peace, land and bread, and peace they did make with Germany at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in January 1918. The German military command then pushes in a last desperate offensive. They bring the troops that were fighting on the Eastern Front to join their comrades on the Western Front in a last desperate bid to win the war. Well, this fails. The naval blockade of the British Royal Navy is having its effect within Germany. There are shortages, food shortages, suffering, riots and so on. Probably the most significant military factor which leads to the German defeat is the arrival of increasing numbers of fresh American troops to join the British and French. And the war is lost for Germany. This is a huge blow to the prestige of the conservative elites, Kaiser Wilhelm, senior generals and so on, who had been behind starting the war essentially in many ways. So a big blow to the prestige of the conservative right-wing elites. Let's move on and look at the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. Let's have a look at the questions, which you should hopefully be making notes on as the lesson progresses. Let's have a look at question one. So how and why did Imperial Germany collapse? How and why did socialists disagree after the Kaiser abdicated? Why was the use of the Free Corps in 1919 controversial? And the final question, what were the weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution? Well, as I say, do make notes on those. Any vocabulary that you're not sure about, research it, bring it to class. Make sure you've answered these questions, or again, you're prepared to discuss and debate them when you get to class. You might want to structure your notes in the form of a mind map. I guess that's up to you. Let's move on and look at the revolution itself. So this takes place in 3 stages. It's like a 3-act play. The first is the October 1918 is the revolution from above, an attempt by the conservative elites to restructure Germany along more democratic lines and hopefully retain something of a grip on power. The second stage, in November of 1918, is the popular revolution of the moderate socialists. And the third stage, in January 1919, is an attempt by the extreme socialists, the extreme left wing, to take power. This leads finally to the establishment of the Weimar Republic. So let's look at stage 1, the so-called revolution from above. Well, in September of 1918, Ludendorff and Hindenburg let Kaiser Wilhelm II know that the war is lost. There are also increasing demands within Germany for the abdication of the Kaiser, who's becoming an increasingly unpopular figure. So they persuade him to step down from many of his powers as emperor, as Kaiser of Germany. So he agrees to restrict his powers reluctantly, so he loses the power to appoint and dismiss ministers. This is an attempt really to democratize Germany. We'll look at a little bit more detail at that. He does kind of remain ceremonial head of state. There's an attempt now to construct a more democratic form of government, a more inclusive form of government. So Prince Max of Baden is appointed German Chancellor, and for the first time the government now includes representatives of the major parties of the Reichstag. For example, Philipp Scheidemann of the Social Democrats, the SPD, and Matthias Erzberger of the Catholic Centre Party. Now this is something which Ludendorff, Hindenburg, the Kaiser, they are in no way in favour of enlarging democracy. They're in no way in favour of especially letting in the Social Democrats, the hated socialists, into government. So why do they do this? Why do they attempt to democratise the government of Germany? Well, probably 2 reasons. The first is that they're hoping that a more democratic Germany may get better terms at the future peace conference. A second reason is that they're probably hoping, specifically Ludendorff and Hindenburg, to deflect some of the blame within Germany for losing the war onto the new government, which will be signing an armistice and a peace treaty. Well, this attempt at retaining some power by the conservative elites, by democratizing to a certain extent, kind of fails. They're overtaken by events within Germany, by the so-called popular revolution, leading to moderate socialists taking power. So let's look at some of those events. The Germans are making overtures. They're talking with the United States about a possible armistice to end the war, but the United States is holding firm. Look, they're saying that the Kaiser is not allowed to remain in any form. The Kaiser has to go. Again, within Germany, there are demands for the complete abdication for the Kaiser. It's become a rather unpopular figure for many within Germany. Now events spiral out of control. Admiral Scheer, again, without even asking this government for permission, decides to launch a last major offensive of the German Navy, a sort of suicidal attempt to break the blockade of the British Navy. Well, this is not greeted with any enthusiasm by German sailors, and they mutiny against their officers at Wilhelmshaven. This is the Kiel Mutiny, a mutiny of the sailors against their officers. They refuse to obey orders. What happens now is the Soviets seize control within Germany. What are the Soviets? The Soviets are councils which are elected by factory workers, sailors, and soldiers. So these are councils elected by the common people, and they start to take control throughout Germany. Hamburg, the city of Hamburg, is taken control of by the Soviets. The Soviets take control in Cologne, in Frankfurt, in Munich, and in the capital, Berlin. The Soviets, by the 9th of November, have effectively taken control of Germany at the local level. Now, the Soviets are socialists, and they're therefore associated with, they're effectively run by the Social Democrats, the SPD. So the Social Democrats, effectively at the local level, now control Germany. It's realised now by the elite that their attempt to sort of restructure Germany, the so-called revolution from above, has failed. The Kaiser is basically, well, actually, Prince Max announces the abdication of the Kaiser without telling him on the 9th of November. And on the 10th of November, the Kaiser flees to Holland. Prince Max now realises, again, he's realised himself that this revolution from above has failed, and he appoints Ebert as the next Chancellor of Germany. So Ebert's now the next Chancellor of Germany. Now, Friedrich Ebert is from the Social Democrats. You now have an interim government, a six-man government, and they're all socialists. It's an interim government, and it's going to decide what form the future government of Germany will take. Now, we're going to look now. You should definitely make some notes on these and ask questions about them in class if you have any issues or difficulties with them. Ebert is actually from the more moderate section of the Social Democrats. In other words, he does want a socialist Germany, but he wants it to be run along the lines of a multi-party democracy. In other words, he doesn't want a Soviet-style Russia with rule by the Soviets and the workers. He wants a multi-party democracy. But Ebert himself knows that there are more extreme elements within the Socialist Party who do want a Soviet Russia. So basically, he's afraid of a revolution from the more extreme elements within the socialist left wing. He's a moderate socialist. He doesn't want the extreme socialists to take power. So what you have now is you have a deal with the right wing. General Groener, the chief of staff of the German army, he makes a telephone call to Ebert, and he says, look, your new government can have the support and loyalty of the armed forces. Kind of surprising, really, because we know the armed forces are conservative right-wingers. So why would they offer their support to the left wing? Well, Ebert says, Groener, rather, says this. He says, look, if your government promises to take prompt action against any sort of communist uprisings, if you guarantee that you're going to form a national assembly, in other words, a representative multi-party democracy, and if you leave the command of the military with the current professional officer corps, we will guarantee you the support of the loyalty of the armed forces, and especially, of course, against a communist and extreme left-wing uprising. Well, Ebert is aware of the danger of a left-wing uprising, so he agrees. There are a couple of very significant consequences of this so-called Ebert-Groener Pact. The first of these is it creates more of a division between the moderate socialists in the SPD and the more hardline left-wing Marxists. Furthermore, it leaves a very conservative, not huge fan of democracy. It leaves the senior commanders of the army self-governing. And again, in future, this is going to be a potential enemy of democracy. Let's move on, look at the next event. So on the 11th of November, it's the armistice. The armistice is negotiated. This new six-man government negotiates the armistice with the Allies. It's the end of fighting. Now, let's have a look at another significant agreement. This is the so-called, apologies, I'm probably pronouncing these names wrong. This is the Stinners-Lejeune Agreement on the 15th of November. Well, the Ebert-Groener Pact was between the new moderate socialists and the army. The Stinners-Lejeune Agreement is between the moderate socialists and industrial leaders within Germany. So this industrial tycoon, Hugo Stinners, he meets with Karl Lejeune, who is a trade unionist for the Social Democrats. Excuse me. And another deal is reached. Hugo Stinners says, look, if you moderate socialists guarantee the continuing orderly production within factories, if you end wild strikes, if you drive back the influence of the left-wing councils, and it prevent nationalisation of the means of production. In other words, prevent a complete sort of Soviet-style takeover of the economy by the German state, then we will make concessions that you socialists have been asking for within Germany. So we'll give more workers' rights. And one of the workers' rights that the socialists have been asking for a long time is an 8-hour working day. So a deal is struck between the moderate socialists and the industrial leaders within Germany. The Stinners-Lejeune Agreement. Let's move on and see what events unfold next. The Spartacist Challenge. So we're going to have a little look now at divisions within the socialists themselves. The SPD. So the SPD divided. Back in 1914, at the beginning of the war, the more moderate members of the Social Democrats had actually supported the war. Whereas the more extreme left-wingers viewed it as a sort of capitalist struggle, the more Marxist elements within the party were anti-war. And in 1917, these more left-wing socialists split off from the Social Democrats to form the Independent Socialists. Now, fast forward to November of 1918. The Soviets have taken power throughout Germany. There is now a debate within the Soviets. Should Germany become a democratic, multi-party republic or a single-party communist state with rule by the Soviets, the workers' councils? Well, the moderate socialists are the majority within the Social Democrats. And in December of 1918, at the convention of the Soviets, there is a vote of 344 to 98 for a national assembly, which is basically going to form a constitution along multi-party democratic lines. So the hardline, more extreme Marxists lose this vote. Well, they aren't happy about it. And the more extreme left-wing elements of the extreme left-wingers split away from the USPD, split away from the Independent Socialists, and they form the, drumroll, the Spartacus League. In 1919, they formed the Spartacus League. Now, this is led by the theorists, thinkers, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They are hard-line Marxists. They want a Soviet-style state. So as I said, in 1919, they split from the independents, who have already split away from the more moderate Social Democrats. They rename themselves the German Communist Party, and the acronym for that in German is the KPD. So, the KPD, the German Communist Party, they don't want a multi-party democracy. They believe that that will lead to a retention, a continuance of the bourgeois middle class and the upper class conservative elites retaining a hold on power. They don't believe it will lead to a more fair and equal distribution of wealth throughout Germany and more rights for workers. So they want a workers' state along Russian Soviet lines. Let's move on. And look at what happens next. So the Spartacists, sorry, you can pronounce this two ways, Spartacist or Spartacist, Spartacist would be the German pronunciation, I guess. They have a dilemma now. What do they do? Do they accept the vote of the Council of Soviets and try and take part within a democratic Germany? Or do they try and seize power by force, which they believe is necessary in order to sort of establish a real Soviet Russia with real rights for workers and more equal distribution of wealth? Well, in some ways, it seems that the situation is in favour for the Spartacists, the hardline communists taking power. They do have backing from Soviet Russia. They do have the support of some radicals, especially within the trade unions. There is hunger and unrest throughout Germany, and if you know anything about the Russian Revolution, that was certainly a catalysing force for the Bolsheviks taking power there. The army has disintegrated at the end of the war, and so there's no united army theoretically going to provide any opposition to them. However, in other ways, it's not so favourable, not so realistic that they seize power. For example, they don't really have any serious, meticulous, detailed plans, especially military plans, to take over Germany. Liebknecht and Luxemburg, they're thinkers, not doers. They're theorists, not practical military strategists. And there are powerful forces, powerful conservative forces within Germany. And the moderate socialists have actually done deals with these with these powerful conservative forces. Remember the Ebert-Groener Pact, where the army has promised support for the moderate socialists against any possible communist uprising. The Stinnes-Legion Pact, where the industrial tycoons have made some concessions to the socialists. So they do make a bid for power. The Spartacists do make a bid to try and take over Germany and do it along sort of Bolshevik Russian lines. So what happens during the so-called Spartacus week? Well, this guy on the left with the bushy moustache is Gustav Nosk, and he's the Social Democrat defense minister. The picture in the middle of these aggressive-looking guys with their tank with a scary-looking skull and crossbones on it, these are members of the Free Corps. Now, who are the Free Corps? Who were the Free Corps? There are about 150 corps, 150 groups of them. They're voluntary paramilitaries. So in other words, they're not the official army of Germany. What they are is about 400,000 of them, and they're mostly ex-soldiers who've come back from the Western Front. They haven't been forced to give up their weapons, so many of them still have access to hard military hardware, and they're loyal to their old officers. These guys are brutalized by 4 years of war in many cases, or even if let's just say they've had an intense brutalizing military experience. They've lost respect for human life. Many of them are right-wing and hate Marxism, hate communism. So a lot of them are named after their commanders. So for example, you've got the Erhard Brigade, named after their commander Erhard. You've got the Free Corps Epp, named after their commander Epp. Now, what happens is, Gustav Nosk, he's a socialist, he's a left-winger, but he makes a kind of deal with the devil. He makes a deal with these right-wing groups because they both have a common interest, a common enemy, which is the extreme socialists. Neither of these guys want the extreme socialists, the communists, to take power. So the Free Corps are unleashed, and I mean unleashed. They're brutal, almost sadistic in their violence. In Berlin, in January of 1919, there's actually an anti-government demonstration. I think what happens is a socialist police chief has been dismissed, and people come out onto the streets protesting against that. The Spartacists see how many people have come out on the streets, and in a slightly disorganised way, they think they can seize control of the moment. They declare a revolution, try to take over government buildings. They are armed, but they are crushed by the far more well-organised and better armed Free Corps. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht are both brutally killed by the Spartacists. Spring of 1919 in the Ruhr, that's the industrial area of Germany in the west, there's a general strike inspired by the KPD. Again, this is rather violently crushed by the Spartacists. And in May of 1919, the Bavarian Soviet Republic is declared. It's a breakaway communist republic within Germany. And again, the moderate socialists dispatch the Free Corps to put this down, and 600 people are killed in vicious fighting, the put down of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Well, to the conservative elite, to the right-wingers, this Free Corps are seen as saviours of Germany from these pernicious, evil communist influences. However, the use of the Free Corps by the moderate socialists makes the communists see the Social Democrats, the SPD, as traitors. And a split opens between the moderate socialists and the extreme socialists, which is going to prove very, very decisive, very, very influential later on in German politics. Let's look briefly at the January 1919 elections and the formation of the Weimar Constitution. So January 1919, elections go ahead. 80% of the vote, and there's a very high voter turnout, goes to moderate parties which are in favour of multi-party democracy. So there's SPD, the Social Democrats, the Catholic Centre Party, Zentrum, and a party called the German Democratic Party, the DDP. Together they make up 80% of the vote. So 80% of the German electorate votes for democratic parties. This seems very hopeful for the future of German democracy. The German Nationalist Party, the DNVP, they're a kind of right-wing party, if you remember, favoured by the Junkers, by the right-wing conservative elite. They only get 10%, so it seems very hopeful for the future of German democracy. A caveat, though, is that this German Democratic Party, the DDP, this is their highest ever. I think about 20% of the vote. They never get anything near that in later votes. The Social Democrats and the Centre Party do carry on getting significant numbers of votes from their sections of Germany, the workers and the Catholics. But this Democratic Party does lose a lot of votes. Probably people in January 1919 are voting for the Democratic Party. The middle class are voting for the Democrat Party, hoping a more democratic Germany is going to be treated favourably in a future peace settlement. And as I say, that vote declines later on. Let's look briefly at the Weimar Constitution. It's a presidential parliamentary constitution. It's a mixture of a sort of an American-style presidential with a British-style parliamentary democracy. So the president is the head of state. He's effectively replaced the Kaiser in that position, and he's going to be, or she, is going to be voted for every 7 years. The Reichstag is going to be voted for every 4 years, and that's going to be voted for by proportional representation. The Reichstag is the main lawmaking body. The president has something called Article 48 powers. In times of emergency in Germany, he can bypass the Reichstag and enact emergency laws and suspend civil liberties to protect Germany from future emergencies. He's got these emergency powers under Article 48. Well, it's an ultra-democratic constitution, more democratic, for example, than Britain and France were at the time. Both men and women over 20 could vote, so there's enfranchisement for women. It's proportional representation, which means that if, let's say, a party gets 5% of the votes, then 5% of the members of parliament will be members of that party. Very democratic. This is opposed to first-past-the-post system, which, for example, exists in Britain. Ask questions in class more about that if you're confused about that. So, proportional representation, but most men and women have the vote, and they vote for the president, and they vote for the Reichstag. There's also a Bill of Rights. There's a lot of protection for the common person. New rights which didn't exist under the old imperial right. So there's freedom of speech, there's freedom of association, and freedom to join trade unions. There's freedom from arbitrary arrest. The police can't simply enter your home without a warrant. There are a lot of basic freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution, although again, these freedoms can be suspended under Article 48 if the President decides there is a state of emergency. It's also a federal system. The United States is another example of a federal system where you do have a central government, in this case the Reichstag, but you also have regional governments, and there are 17 Länder within Germany. That's areas of Germany that each have their own regional government. So, for example, foreign policy is decided by the central government, but some aspects are decided by local government. Things such as education, policing and religion are decided by local government. And these Länder meet in a body called the Reichsrat. Well, let's have a move on to our look at possible weaknesses within the Weimar Constitution. Now, proportional representation has been identified by some as a weakness of the Weimar Constitution because it helped lead to unstable coalitions, governments which broke down when they disagreed with each other, necessitating new elections, and it did allow extremists such as the communists and the Nazis later on to gain seats where they might not have gained seats in Parliament under a different electoral system. But perhaps another way of looking at it is perhaps that not that proportional representation was such an issue, but that Germany was so divided, which meant that the parties, it was difficult for the different parties and groups to work together. You had a very deeply divided Germany. And you do have systems of proportional representation in countries today which do work reasonably well. Article 48. Well, that wasn't an issue or a problem throughout the 1920s. For example, Friedrich Ebert used it several times to deal with emergencies within Germany in the early 1920s. But by the early 1930s, Article 48 certainly was abused by groups within Germany. What you did is you had certain groups within Germany that throughout the 1920s had accepted Weimar democracy, but weren't really big fans of it. They were more in seeking forms of authoritarian, conservative, right-wing government. These are people such as the conservative elites and many of the senior army, who again were right-wing, authoritarian, wanted a more authoritarian, less democratic form of government. Right-wing nationalists, and nationalism goes hand in hand with the right-wing. And later on, Hindenburg, who has become president of Germany, all of these groups start to be in favour of, and Hindenburg uses Article 48, and essentially democracy is largely destroyed in its early stages by excessive use of Article 48, bypassing the Reichstag. So how revolutionary was the revolution? Was it a revolution? In some ways, yes. Imperial Germany fell and was replaced by an extremely democratic form of government. Women, for example, got the vote. You got universal suffrage for the first time. So in some ways, yes, it was a huge change. It was a revolution. In other ways, no. There was continuity. Conservative right-wing groups within Germany who were no fans of democracy continued in power. The army, for example, the senior corps, if you remember the Ebert Groener Pact, they remained in power. Senior police, judges, civil servants and professors, all of whom were really members of the conservative elite and weren't fans of democracy, remained in power. And these are potentially powerful enemies of democracy. They are hostile to democratic forms of government. Again, if you remember the Stins-Lejeune Pact and the fact that there wasn't a Soviet-style revolution, wealth wasn't really redistributed on a more equal basis throughout Germany. So it remained concentrated in the hands of the conservative elite, industrial tycoons and so on. So you didn't have a major redistribution of wealth within Germany. So I hope you've made some good notes and that was useful for you, and I'll see you in class.